April 14th, 1868. That morning, a plantation overseer named Nathaniel Gisham stepped into the record room at Bellwood Estate, a sprawling property in rural Wilkinson County, Mississippi. Without hesitation, he pulled every ledger from the shelves: contracts, crop tallies, bills of sale, correspondence. 23 years of the estate's history. He stacked them carefully in the middle of the wooden floor, struck a flame, and watched as the papers caught fire. By the time smoke curled past the windows and drifted toward the main house, Gisham was gone. He slipped into the dense pine woods bordering the plantation and was never seen again. The blaze devoured everything: registers of births and deaths, transaction records, accounts of cotton yields, letters exchanged with neighboring plantations, and, most unsettling of all, a collection of leather-bound journals that some staff later insisted contained accounts no decent soul should ever have had to read. Authorities searched for 6 weeks. Deputies questioned workers, neighbors, even passing travelers. But every conversation ended the same way, with tight lips, lowered gazes, and silence. Whatever had been written in those records seemed to frighten people more than the fire itself. What could drive a man to destroy not only his employer's history, but the very documents that proved his own place in it? Before we go further into the mystery of Nathaniel Gisham and the secrets reduced to ash at Bellwood Estate, be sure to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and turn on notifications so you don't miss stories like this. Leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. We're always curious to know which towns and cities these dark histories travel to. Now back to 1868. Mississippi was still reeling. The Civil War had ended 3 years earlier, yet its wounds were everywhere: charred barns, neglected fields, and hollow-eyed veterans drifting along dusty roads. Reconstruction had begun reshaping the South, but the transformation was uneven and often bitter. Bellwood Estate, situated about 15 miles southwest of Woodville near the Louisiana line, had once ranked among the region's wealthiest cotton plantations. At its height, 2,000 acres were worked by more than 300 enslaved people. By the spring of 1868, that world had collapsed. Under the new labor system imposed during Reconstruction, the plantation struggled on with only a fraction of its former workforce. Many who remained did so, not out of loyalty, but because options were scarce and survival left little room for choice. The owner, Colonel Marcus Belleloux, had returned from war diminished in body and fortune. He had lost his left arm and nearly all his wealth. His wife had died of fever during his absence. Both of his sons had been killed at Shiloh. Creditors hovered, waiting. The once grand house, with its white columns and wide verandas, had begun to weather and sag. The former slave quarters, now referred to as workers' housing under new laws, were still occupied. The chains that once bound the people there were gone, but they had been replaced by economic hardship and the harsh reality that the countryside beyond offered little promise. It was in this fragile, uneasy landscape that Nathaniel Gisham chose to set the past on fire and vanish into it. Nathaniel Gisham had served as Bellwood's head overseer since 1845, making him one of the longest tenure in the county. At 52 years old, he was a lean, weather-worn man, with a face that seemed permanently set in an expression of cold assessment. Unlike many overseers who ruled through explosive violence, Gisham operated with calculated precision. He kept meticulous records of everything: every pound of cotton picked, every infraction committed, every punishment administered, every birth, every death. Workers spoke of him in hushed tones, not because he was cruel in the theatrical sense, but because his cruelty was systematic, documented, impossible to escape. After emancipation, Gisham had adapted with unsettling ease to the new order. While other overseers fled or drank themselves into obsolescence, he remained essential to Bellwood's operations. He negotiated labor contracts, managed the books, corresponded with merchants, and kept the estate functioning even as Colonel Belleau descended into melancholic isolation. If anything, Gisham's power had increased. He was now the practical master of Bellwood, though he never claimed the title. Among the workers, an elderly woman named Ruth Vance held a particular status. Born on the plantation in 1801, she had served in the main house for decades, first as a chambermaid, then as the colonel's wife's personal attendant. Now 67 and bent with arthritis, she no longer worked the fields, but helped in the kitchen and tended the small vegetable gardens. Ruth possessed a sharp memory and a sharper tongue, traits that had earned her both respect and wariness from her community. Another key figure was Thomas Hirricks, a freedman in his early 30s who had remained at Bellwood after emancipation to work as a carpenter and general handyman. Thomas could read and write, skills he had learned secretly during the war from a sympathetic Union soldier, and he had ambitions of eventually saving enough to purchase land of his own. He was methodical, observant, and possessed an acute sense of when something was wrong. In the weeks leading up to April 14th, several workers noticed changes in Nathaniel Gisham's behavior. He had always been a man of rigid routine, but now he seemed distracted, prone to standing motionless in the middle of tasks, as if listening to something only he could hear. He stopped eating meals with the other white staff members and began taking his food alone in the record room, surrounded by his ledgers and files. Dark circles appeared beneath his eyes. His hands, usually steady, developed a slight tremor. Thomas Hirricks first noticed Gisham's strange fixation on the records one evening in late March. He had been repairing a loose board on the office building's porch when he glanced through a window and saw the overseer sitting at his desk, surrounded by stacks of old ledgers. Gisham was methodically turning pages, his finger tracing down columns of entries, occasionally pausing to stare at particular passages with an expression Thomas couldn't quite read. Was it fear? Guilt? Horror? The lamplight cast long shadows across Gisham's face, and for a moment Thomas saw not the calculating administrator he had always known, but a man confronting something terrible in those careful notations. The atmosphere at Bellwood grew increasingly tense as April arrived. Colonel Belleau remained locked in his study most days, drinking imported whiskey and writing letters to relatives who never responded. The few remaining white staff members, a housekeeper, a groundskeeper, and 2 clerks went about their duties with quiet resignation. The freemen and women who had stayed worked their contracted hours and retreated to their cabins, where they spoke in low voices about the strange energy that seemed to permeate the estate. Ruth Vance told anyone who would listen that something was coming to account. She claimed she could smell it in the air, a scent like old paper burning slowly, barely perceptible, but definitely there. Others dismissed this as an old woman's fancy, but Ruth had lived through too much to be easily dismissed. She had survived the plant. At Ation's harshest years, had seen children torn from mothers, husbands sold away from wives, had witnessed acts of casual cruelty so routine they barely registered as noteworthy. If Ruth said something was wrong, people paid attention, even if they didn't say so aloud. The last week of Gisham's presence at Bellwood was marked by increasingly erratic behavior. He was seen pacing the grounds at odd hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, carrying a lantern and a revolver. He stopped sleeping in his small house near the main estate, and instead spent nights in the record room barricading the door from the inside. When Thomas attempted to deliver some carpentry work reports, Gisham snapped at him to leave the papers outside, and never, under any circumstances, to enter without explicit permission. On the morning of April 13th, Gisham emerged from the record room with his face ashen and his clothing rumpled. He walked directly to Colonel Belleau's study and remained inside for nearly 2 hours. Witnesses later reported hearing raised voices, though they couldn't make out specific words. When Gisham exited, the colonel called for whiskey and didn't emerge for the rest of the day. April 14th, 1868, dawned clear and unseasonably warm. By mid-morning, the temperature had climbed into the high 80s, and the air hung heavy with the promise of afternoon thunderstorms. The workers at Bellwood went about their contracted labor, planting, repairing equipment, tending livestock, while the estate's peculiar tension continued to build like static before lightning. Thomas Hicks was working on the main house's western porch, replacing rotted boards, when he noticed Nathaniel Gisham emerging from his small residence, carrying a large canvas bag. The overseer's face was pale, his expression set in grim determination. He walked with purposeful strides towards the record building, a separate structure, about 50 yards from the main house, constructed of brick with narrow windows, designed more for security than light. Gisham unlocked the record room door and entered, closing it firmly behind him. Thomas thought little of it at first. The overseer spent considerable time among his ledgers and files, but something about the man's demeanor, the rigid set of his shoulders, the way he had glanced around before entering as if checking whether anyone was watching, struck Thomas as unusual. An hour passed. Thomas continued his work, the rhythmic sound of his hammer marking time. Other workers moved about the grounds. The day proceeded with deceptive normalcy. Then Ruth Vance appeared on the main house's back steps, her head tilted as if sniffing the air. "You smell that?" she called to Thomas. He paused, setting down his hammer. At first, he detected nothing unusual, but then it registered. A faint, acrid scent like burning paper. His eyes immediately went to the record building. No smoke was visible from his angle, but the smell was growing stronger. "Lord have mercy," Ruth whispered. "He's doing it." Thomas climbed down from the porch and started walking toward the record building. As he drew closer, he could see thin wisps of smoke seeping from beneath the door and through cracks around the window frames. The smell intensified, not just paper, but leather and cloth, the distinctive odor of books and documents burning. He ran the final distance and pounded on the door. "Mr. Gisham, sir, there's a fire." No response came from inside, but Thomas could hear the crackling of flames. He pounded again harder. "Mr. Gisham!" Other workers had noticed now. They began gathering, hesitant, uncertain, afraid to act, but unable to ignore what was happening. Someone ran to fetch water. Someone else went to alert the main house. Thomas tried the door. Locked. He moved to the nearest window and peered through the dusty glass. What he saw would stay with him for the rest of his life. The interior of the record room was filled with smoke, but through the haze, Thomas could make out a large fire burning in the center of the floor. Ledgers, papers, and bound journals were stacked around it, some already consumed by flames, others waiting their turn. And standing in the corner, silhouetted against the growing inferno, was Nathaniel Gisham, holding a leather-bound volume. He wasn't trying to extinguish the fire or escape. He was watching it burn with an expression of terrible satisfaction mixed with something that looked like relief. "Mr. Gisham!" Thomas shouted, slapping his palm against the window. "You have to get out!" Gisham's eyes snapped toward the window. For a moment, their gazes locked. Thomas saw something in the overseer's face he had never seen before. Raw, unconcealed fear, but fear mixed with purpose. Gisham mouthed something that Thomas couldn't hear through the glass, then through the journal he was holding into the flames. He turned away from the window and moved toward the back of the room, disappearing into the smoke. By now, a dozen workers had gathered along with the groundskeeper and one of the clerks. Someone had brought buckets of water, but no one was sure what to do. The door was locked, the windows too narrow to climb through, and the fire was clearly beyond any attempt at extinguishing. "Break down the door!" the clerk shouted. Thomas and two other men found a heavy timber and used it as a battering ram. The door, solid oak with iron reinforcements, resisted their first attempts. The smoke was pouring out more thickly now, dark and choking. They rammed the door again. On the fourth attempt, something splintered, and on the fifth, the door crashed inward. A wall of heat and smoke rolled out, driving them back. The intrigue, or was, an inferno. Flames covered most of the floor and were climbing the walls, consuming decades of carefully maintained records. The intense heat made it impossible to enter more than a few steps. "Gisham!" someone shouted into the burning room. "Gisham, are you in there?" No answer came except the roar of fire. It was then that Ruth Vance, who had been standing at a distance, called out, "He ain't in there! Look!" She was pointing toward the woods beyond the record building. Others turned to look at the tree, barely visible among the pines and oaks. Was a figure moving quickly away from the estate. Even at that distance, the lean build and purposeful stride were recognizable as Nathaniel Gisham's. Someone began running after him, but the figure had already vanished into the dense forest. By the time several men reached the trees, there was no trace of which direction he had gone. Behind them, the wreck building was now fully engulfed. There was nothing to do but let it burn and ensure the fire didn't spread to other structures. Workers formed bucket brigades to wet down the surrounding buildings. The main structure, being brick, wasn't in danger of collapse, but everything inside it was being reduced to ash. Colonel Bellelou emerged from the main house, drawn by the commotion. He stood on the veranda, swaying slightly, staring at the burning building with an expression of numb shock. He didn't speak, didn't give orders, simply watched as 23 years of records were destroyed. The fire burned for 3 hours. When it finally exhausted its fuel, the record building remained standing. Blackened brick walls and an intact roof, but its interior was a charred ruin. Everything that had been stored inside, every ledger and contract and journal, had been reduced to ash and fragments. That evening, as the sun set red through the smoke-hazed air, authorities were summoned from Woodville. The county sheriff, a man named Porter, who had held the position since before the war, arrived with 2 deputies. They interviewed witnesses, examined the burned building, and noted that Nathaniel Gisham had disappeared into the forest with nothing but the clothes on his back and whatever he had been carrying in the canvas bag. Thomas had seen. Sheriff Porter organized a search party. Local men, both white and black, spread out into the woods with lanterns and dogs. They searched through the night and all the following day. They found no trace of Gisham, no tracks that led anywhere conclusive, no signs of passage, nothing. It was as if he had been swallowed by the forest itself. The search continued for a week, expanding outward in widening circles. Inquiries were sent to neighboring counties, to towns along major routes, to river crossings. Descriptions of Gisham were posted. A reward was offered for information. Nothing came of any of it. On April 22nd, Sheriff Porter officially declared Nathaniel Gisham a fugitive wanted for destruction of property and abandonment of contracted duties. But even Porter seemed to sense that finding the man was unlikely. In his official report, he noted, "Subject displayed signs of mental disturbance in the days preceding the incident. Motive for destruction of records remains unclear." Without the documents themselves, which subject deliberately and thoroughly destroyed, we cannot determine what information they contained that drove him to such desperate action. In the weeks following Gisham's disappearance, Bellwood Estate fell into a state of liminal existence. The colonel withdrew even further into his bottles and melancholy. The few remaining white staff members, spooked by the inexplicable violence of what had happened, began seeking positions elsewhere. The freed men and women who had stayed under labor contracts found themselves, Levs, in an odd position, still working, still being paid. When the colonel remembered, but without clear oversight or structure, Thomas Herrick's found himself taking on more responsibilities by default. Someone needed to organize work schedules, coordinate with merchants, keep basic accounts. He had neither the authority nor the desire for such a role, but the alternative was watching the estate collapse entirely. So he kept makeshift records, noting crop plantings and equipment repairs, in a simple ledger he purchased with his own money from a Woodville general store. Ruth Vance, meanwhile, appointed herself the keeper of unofficial memory. With the estate's formal records destroyed, she began telling stories, not the sanitized histories that had appeared in Gisham's ledgers, but the human truths that had happened alongside and beneath those official accounts. She told of a woman named Sarah who had been sold to a plantation in Alabama after her owner discovered she could read. She spoke of twin brothers separated at age 8, one kept at Bellwood, the other sent to a New Orleans auction house. She described a man called Abraham who had tried to escape to Union lines during the war and had been tracked down by dogs and dragged back. What Gisham's punishment had been. Ruth said only that Abraham was never the same after and had died of pneumonia the following winter. These stories circulated through the remaining community, whispered on porches in the evening, shared in the small church building where workers gathered on Sundays. A question began to take shape in these conversations. What exactly had been in those records that Gisham burned? The official answer, plantation operations, contracts, crop accounts, seemed insufficient. Those were the kind of documents you might hide or destroy to cover financial malfeasance, perhaps. But men didn't burn their own futures and flee in to the wilderness over ordinary theft or embezzlement. No, what Gisham had destroyed must have been something else. Something terrible enough that its revelation would have been worse than exile and poverty. Thomas Hricks developed his own theory, though he shared it with few people. During his carpentry work, he had occasionally seen fragments of Gisham's record-keeping system. The overseer hadn't just noted the obvious facts, crop yields, worker assignments, but had maintained elaborate cross-referenced journals documenting everything. Who had resisted work? Who had attempted escape? Who had broken tools? Who had spoken back? More disturbing, Gisham had recorded punishments in clinical detail. Not just that a person had been whipped, but how many lashes, with what instrument, which doctor had treated the wounds afterward, how long until the person could return to work. What Thomas suspected, though he couldn't prove, was that Gisham's records had been so comprehensive that they would have served as evidence in legal proceedings. Under the new Reconstruction laws, there were ongoing attempts to prosecute former slaveholders and overseers for specific acts of cruelty. Most such prosecutions failed due to lack of documentation, witness intimidation, or simple judicial reluctance. But if a detailed record existed, meticulously maintained by the perpetrator himself, Thomas kept this theory quiet. The Reconstruction period was precarious. Federal troops had withdrawn from most of Mississippi by 1868, and the old power structures were reasserting themselves. Talking too openly about prosecuting white men for how they had treated the enslaved could get you killed. But he did share his thoughts with one person, Ruth Vance. The old woman listened, nodded slowly, then said, "You're half right. But it wasn't just what he'd done, it was what the colonel ordered." What the visiting winners done when they came through. What the doctors did. Gisham wrote it all down. Every death, every sale, every... She paused, her face hardening. Every child that got took, every woman that disappeared for a while and came back different. He had it all written down, dates and names and details. But why would he do that? Thomas asked, "Why keep such dangerous records?" Ruth's expression was bitter, because that's who he was. A man who believed in order and systems. He thought, if you write something down proper in neat columns with good handwriting, it stops being evil and becomes just business. She spat the last word like a curse. But something changed. Don't know what. Maybe he finally saw what all those neat columns added up to. Maybe someone was going to use those records against him. Maybe he just couldn't live with it no more. Whatever it was, he chose to burn 23 years of horror rather than let the world see what he'd done. As spring turned to summer, strange reports began reaching Bellwood from the surrounding area. A shopkeeper in Woodville claimed a man matching Gisham's description had come into his store shortly after the disappearance, purchased supplies, and paid with a handful of old coins before leaving without a word. A farmer in adjacent Franklin County reported seeing someone matching Gisham's build camping deep in the woods. But when the farmer approached, the figure had fled. A riverboat captain swore he had given passage to a man who resembled Gisham, fing him across the Mississippi into Louisiana, though he couldn't be certain. None of these sightings led anywhere. If they were genuine, Gisham was moving randomly, staying nowhere long enough to be caught. More likely they were misidentifications, people seeing what they expected to see, or perhaps even deliberate lies told by those sympathetic to Gisham's flight. Sheriff Porter made one more serious attempt to find the missing overseer in June 1868. Acting on a tip that Gisham had family in Kentucky, he sent inquiries to sheriffs in Paducah, Louisville, and Lexington. All reported no sign of the fugitive. Porter also checked with federal authorities, thinking Gisham might try to leave the country entirely. Again, nothing. By late summer, active pursuit had essentially ceased. Gisham had successfully vanished, and there were more pressing concerns. Reconstruction politics, resurgent violence from groups like the Ku Klux Klan, economic struggles. One vanished overseer, however mysterious his exit, couldn't compete for attention. At Bellwood, the estate continued its slow decline. Colonel Bellow died in September 1868, found in his study with an empty laudanum bottle. His debts exceeded his assets, and the property entered legal limbo. Most of the workers left, finding employment elsewhere or heading north. Within a year, Bellwood was abandoned, its buildings left to the elements and the slow reclamation of nature. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the mystery deepened. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark historical mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. The truth about what happened at Bellwood Estate is far stranger than anyone could have imagined. Thomas Herrick's left Bellwood in October 1868 and moved to Natchez, where he found work as a carpenter. He tried to put the strange events behind him, to focus on building a new life in the uncertain Reconstruction period. But the mystery of Nathaniel Gisham's desperate act continued to trouble him. What could drive a man to destroy his life's work so completely? The answer began to emerge in an unexpected way. In March 1869, nearly a year after Gisham's disappearance, Thomas was working on renovating a merchant's house in Natchez when he overheard a conversation that made his blood run cold. Two men, lawyers by their dress and manner, were discussing a legal case over whiskey in an adjacent room. Thomas, working in the hallway, could hear their voices through the partially open door. "The Bellwood matter is dead," one was saying. "Without the records, we have nothing," Gisham saw to that. "Convenient timing," the other replied dryly. 3 weeks before depositions were scheduled. "You think he was tipped off?" "Someone told him had to be. Otherwise, why burn everything on that specific day?" Thomas's mind raced. Depositions, legal proceedings. He had assumed the fire was about avoiding general accountability. But this suggested something much more specific. After the lawyers left, Thomas sought out one of them, a man named Harrison, who had a reputation for taking on controversial cases. After some initial hesitation, and perhaps impressed by Thomas's obvious intelligence and education, Harrison explained the situation. In early 1868, a freed woman named Catherine Wells had attempted to bring a civil suit against the estates of several plantation owners, including Colonel Bellew. Catherine had been enslaved at Bellwood until 1862, when she had been sold to a plantation in Louisiana under circumstances she claimed were both illegal and deliberately brutal. Her case was complex, relying on proving specific dates and transactions, exactly the kind of information that would have been documented in plantation records. More significantly, Catherine's case was being watched by federal attorneys as a potential test case. If successful, it could open the door for hundreds of similar suits across the South, each demanding compensation or justice for specific documented acts of cruelty during the slavery period. Depositions had been scheduled for early May 1868. Subpoenas had been prepared for plantation records from Bellwood and 3 other estates. The legal proceedings had been kept relatively quiet, both to avoid intimidating witnesses and to prevent potential destruction of evidence. But somehow Nathaniel Gisham had learned about it, and on April 14th, 3 weeks before those records would have been legally compelled for review, he had destroyed them all. "Do you know what happened to Catherine Wells?" Thomas asked Harrison. "Her case." Harrison's expression darkened. Without the Bellwood records, it collapsed. She had testimony, of course, but testimony against documented proof is worth very little, especially when that testimony comes from a freed woman and challenges the word of white plantation families. The case was dismissed in June. Thomas felt something cold settle in his chest. The pieces were falling into place. Gisham hadn't been fleeing his own guilt, or not only his own guilt. He had been protecting an entire system, destroying evidence that could have provided legal accountability for decades of systematic brutality. "There's more," Harrison continued, lowering his voice. "Catherine Wells died in December, officially consumption, but she was healthy as a horse when I deposed her in March. Draw your own conclusions." Thomas left that conversation shaken. He had thought he understood the brutality of the slavery system, having lived through it himself. But this revealed a different dimension: the deliberate, calculated effort to erase evidence to ensure that history would be written without inconvenient documentation. He began asking careful questions among the Freridman community and Natchez, seeking others who had been at Bellwood or knew about Catherine Wells's case. What he discovered was a network of intimidation and silence. Multiple potential witnesses had received threatening visits. One man, who had agreed to testify, had his house burned down. Another had been beaten so severely he lost the use of one eye. And at the center of it all, someone had warned Gisham in time to destroy the records before they could be subpoenaed. Thomas managed to track down 2 other people who had been enslaved at Bellwood, a man named Joshua and a woman named Violet. Both had left the plantation after emancipation and were reluctant to talk, but eventually they shared their memories. Joshua remembered seeing Gisham with visitors in the weeks before the fire. White men, well-dressed, came in a fancy carriage, he said. They met with Greekham in the record room, stayed for hours. After they left, that's when he started acting strange. Violet recalled something else. There was a woman came around maybe 2 weeks before he burned everything. She was asking questions, talking to folks who'd work in the main house. Ruth Vance met with her. I think that was the lawyer lady, the one helping Catherine Wells. Thomas pieced together a timeline. Catherine Wells's attorney had visited Bellwood in late March or early April, gathering information and identifying potential witnesses. Word of this had reached certain powerful individuals, plantation owners, politicians, men with much to lose if records documented their crimes. They had alerted Gisham either directly or through intermediaries. Perhaps they had even ordered him to destroy the records, and Gisham, faced with the choice of preserving his meticulous documentation or protecting himself and others from legal consequences, had chosen fire. But there was another possibility, one that Thomas found both more hopeful and more tragic. Perhaps Gisham had been told to hide or protect the records, but instead, overcome by some crisis of conscience, he had destroyed them completely and fled. This would explain the desperate quality of his actions, the way he had stood among the flames, watching everything burn. It wasn't the behavior of a man following orders. It was the behavior of a man making a terrible final choice. Through the fall of 1869, Thomas Hirricks found himself increasingly obsessed with understanding what had happened at Bellwood. It wasn't healthy. He knew that, but he couldn't let it rest. The idea that such calculated erasure of history could succeed, that powerful men could order the destruction of evidence and face no consequences, ate at him. He began traveling on weekends, using what little money he had saved to visit counties throughout southern Mississippi and eastern Louisiana. He was looking for Nathaniel Gisham, though he wasn't entirely sure what he would do if he found the man. Confront him. Turn him in. Simply ask why. In October 1869, he got his first real lead. A sharecropper in Tensas Parish, Louisiana, mentioned that a man matching Gisham's description had been seen working as a day laborer on a remote farm near Lake St. Joseph. The description was specific: lean build, weathered face, around 50 years old, but notably silent, never speaking unless absolutely necessary, and with hands that trembled constantly. Thomas made the journey a 2-day trip by riverboat and on foot. The farm was isolated, accessible only by a rough track through dense woodland. When he arrived, the owner, a French-speaking Creole farmer named Arseno, was immediately suspicious of a black man asking questions, but Thomas had learned to navigate such situations. He presented himself as looking for work, asked about labor opportunities, mentioned casually that he'd heard there was another carpenter working in the area. Slowly, Arseno relaxed. Yes, there had been a man, quiet fellow, had worked for about 3 weeks doing repairs on barns and fences. Good work, precise. But he had left suddenly, just walked off one morning without collecting his Jess. Did he say where he was going? Thomas asked. Arseno shook his head. Never said much of anything, but the night before he left, I heard him in the barn where he slept. Sounded like crying, maybe, or praying. Something broken in that man. Thomas thanked Arseno and prepared to leave, but then thought to ask one more question. Did he have anything with him? Any belongings? Just a canvas bag, Arseno replied. Kept it with him always, even when working. Wouldn't let it out of his sight. The canvas bag, the same one Thomas had seen Gisham carrying on April 14th, the morning of the fire. Whatever was in that bag, Gisham had considered it important enough to save while destroying everything else. The trail went cold again after that. Thomas heard occasional rumors over the following months. A man resembling Gisham spotted in Alexandria, Louisiana, or working on the docks in Vicksburg, Mississippi, but nothing he could verify. It was as if Gisham had learned to become invisible, to pass through the world, leaving no impression. Then, in February 1870, nearly 2 years after the fire, something extraordinary happened. Thomas received a letter. It had been forwarded through several addresses, finally reaching him at the boarding house in Natchez, where he rented a room. The envelope was cheap, the handwriting shaky, but the return address caught his attention. Shreveport, Louisiana. There was no name, just initials. N.G. Thomas's hands trembled as he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in cramped, hurried writing. Mr. Hendricks, I learned your name from inquiries you have been making. I know you seek answers about April 14th. You deserve them. What I burned was evil. 23 years of documented evil. Every cruelty, every injustice, every crime recorded in neat columns, as if that made them acceptable. I kept those records because I was ordered to, because that was my duty. B. Because I believed that order and precision were virtues in themselves. I was wrong. 3 weeks before I burned it all, I was visited by men representing interests beyond Bellwood. They informed me that Catherine Wells was bringing suit, that records would be subpoenaed, that other cases would follow. They told me to protect the records, to hide them, to be prepared to testify that they had been accidentally destroyed in some previous incident. Instead, I read them. I spent 3 days and nights reading every page of every ledger, every journal, every document. I had kept these records for years without truly comprehending what they documented. Numbers and dates and clinical descriptions had insulated me from the reality. But reading them continuously, start to finish, I finally saw what I had helped perpetuate. I saw children separated from parents, with the sale prices noted beside their ages. I saw punishments recorded with the same dispassion as crop yields. I saw deaths attributed to exhaustion or fever that I knew had other causes. I saw births registered with no father listed, knowing exactly why. I saw escape attempts and their consequences. I saw everything. And I knew that if those records survived, they would not bring justice. They would be used to shield guilty men through legal maneuvering, to intimidate witnesses, to demonstrate that everything had been properly documented and therefore somehow legitimate. The system that created those records would use them to protect itself. So I burned them. I do not seek forgiveness. What I did for 23 years cannot be forgiven. But I wanted you to know why I destroyed the evidence, not to escape justice for myself. I live in justice now every day in the nightmares and the memories, but to prevent those records from serving one more evil purpose. Tell Ruth Vance I am sorry. Tell Catherine Wells's family I am sorry. Tell all of them I am sorry, though sorry is not enough. N.G. Thomas read the letter 3 times, his emotions cycling between anger, sadness, and a kind of grim satisfaction. Gisham hadn't been protecting himself, or not primarily. He had made a terrible calculus that no records were better than records that could be weaponized by those who had committed the crimes documented within them. But there was something else in the letter, something that suggested Gisham's understanding was still incomplete. He had destroyed the records to prevent them from being misused, but in doing so, he had also erased evidence that might have supported some claims for justice. His final act had been just as controlling, just as paternalistic, as his years of record-keeping. He had decided what was best, had taken away even the possibility of using those records for accountability. Thomas folded the letter carefully and placed it in his own journal. He never showed it to anyone else, though he did honor Gisham's request to pass along his apologies to Ruth Vance when he saw her next. The old woman's response was simply, "Sorry, don't bring nobody back." In April 1870, exactly 2 years after the fire, Thomas Herricks made one final journey related to the Bellwood mystery. He had heard that the abandoned estate was being prepared for sale, the last of the legal tangles around Colonel Bellow's debts finally resolved. Before the property passed to new owners, he wanted to see it one more time. The ride from Natchez took most of a day. When Thomas arrived at Bellwood in the late afternoon, he was struck by how thoroughly nature had begun reclaiming the property. The grand main house stood empty, its windows dark, its paint peeling in long strips. The worker housing had collapsed in several places. Weeds grew waist-high across the former cotton fields. The record building, its brick walls scorched black, remained. standing. Thomas approached it slowly, feeling an odd reluctance. The door had been removed, probably salvaged by scavengers, and the interior lay open to the elements. He stepped inside. The fire had consumed everything combustible, but the basic structure remained. The floor was covered with 2 years' worth of blown-in leaves, dirt, and debris. Charred fragments of wood marked where shelves and desks had once stood. The smell of old smoke still lingered faintly, mixed with earth and rot. Thomas walked slowly around the space, imagining it as it had been. Walls lined with ledgers, a desk where Gisham had sat, maintaining his meticulous records, filing cabinets holding decades of documentation. All gone now, reduced to ash and fragments. He was about to leave when something caught his eye. In the far corner, partially buried under accumulated debris, was a piece of metal. Thomas knelt and brushed away the dirt. It was a metal document box, its paint scorched black, but its structure intact. Such boxes were used to store particularly important papers. His heart pounding, Thomas pried open the warped lid. Inside, remarkably preserved, were 3 documents. They hadn't burned completely. The metal box had protected them, though their edges were charred, and some of the writing was obscured by smoke damage. But significant portions were still legible. The first document was a contract of sale dated March 1861. It documented the sale of a woman named Catherine and her 2 children, a boy aged 5 and a girl aged 3, to a plantation in Louisiana. The sale price was itemized. The conditions were noted. Family to be kept together. But there was another notation in the margin added later in different ink. Paran Bellows instruction, children retained at Bellwood. Woman transferred alone, informed children died of fever. Thomas felt sick. Catherine Wells, the woman whose legal ace had triggered the events leading to the fire. The lie about her children documented in Gisham's own hand. The second document was a medical log from the plantation doctor covering 1857 to 1859. It listed treatments provided to workers, causes of death, births recorded. The deaths far outnumbered the births. Causes listed included exhaustion from labor, fever from exposure, injuries during punishment. One entry read, "Child approx 6 months died of neglect. Mother punished for inattention during work hours." The third document was personal correspondence, a letter from Colonel Bellow to another plantation owner, dated 1863. It discussed the war, complaints about the peculiar institution being threatened, strategies for hiding assets and maintaining control, even if the Confederacy fell. The casual cruelty in the language was breathtaking. Thomas carefully removed the 3 documents from the metal box. These fragments, these few survivors of Gisham's fire, were evidence, partial, incomplete, but real. He stood there, in the burned-out record room for a long time, holding those scorched papers, considering what to do. The legal case that had prompted the fire was long over. Catherine Wells was dead. The people who might have used these documents to seek justice had mostly given up or moved on. But the documents were truth. They were proof, and perhaps that mattered on its own terms. Thomas made his decision. He would preserve these fragments. He would place them where they could be found by anyone who cared to look, anyone who wanted to understand what had really happened at Bellwood and places like it. He would not let the fire complete its work of erasure. As he turned to leave the ruined building, Thomas noticed something else. Scratched into the smoke-blackened brick wall near where the metal box had been found, almost invisible unless you knew to look for it. Words, "Car," rubbed shallow but deliberately. "God forgive what I have documented." Gisham's last message left before he set the fire. Not a justification, not an excuse, just a plea. Thomas traced his fingers over the carved words, feeling their rough edges. Then he gathered the documents, placed them carefully in his leather satchel, and left Bellwood Estate for the last time. Thomas Harricks delivered the 3 recovered documents to Harrison, the attorney who had been working on Catherine Wells's case. Though the suit itself was long closed, Harrison agreed to keep the documents as part of his files, creating an official record of their existence. He also helped Thomas write an affidavit describing how and where they had been found. Years later, in the 1890s, when some historians began attempting to document the realities of the slavery system, those documents would be among the sources used. They weren't enough to bring justice. The people who had committed the crimes documented were mostly dead by then, but they served as testament. Nathaniel Gisham was never seen again after his letter to Thomas. There were occasional unverified rumors over the years. Someone matching his description working on railroad construction in Texas, a hermit living in the Arkansas wilderness, a body found drowned in the Red River. That might have been him. Nothing certain. Thomas chose to believe that Gisham had lived out his days haunted by what he had done, carrying that canvas bag with whatever he considered too important to burn, moving from place to place, unable to settle, unable to escape his own history. It seemed a fitting punishment to carry the weight of those records even after destroying them, to be pursued not by law but by memory. Ruth Vance lived until 1876, dying at age 75. She never spoke Gisham's name again after Thomas delivered his apology, but she did continue telling her stories serving oral history that no fire could destroy. At her funeral, more than 200 people came, freed men and women from across the region who knew her as a keeper of memory. Bellwood Estate was eventually purchased by a timber company. The main house was demolished in 1875, its bricks salvaged for other construction. The land was logged, then left to grow wild. The burned record building stood for decades more, a blackened shell that local children told ghost stories about. It finally collapsed in a storm in 1913. Today, there's almost nothing left of Bellwood. The land is privately owned, heavily forested, unmarked. Only if you know exactly where to look can you find the remnants of foundations, the odd piece of rusted machinery, the slight depressions where worker housing once stood. Catherine Wells's children, whom she had been told were dead, were actually sold separately in 1862 to plantations in Georgia. Both survived the war and emancipation. They never learned what happened to their mother, and she never learned they had survived. Thomas Hicks went on to work as a skilled carpenter and eventually became a respected figure within Natchez' freedmen community. He never married, and he refused to speak publicly about what happened at Bellwood. Yet, he recorded his thoughts in a private journal, pages that would not come to light until long after his death. In those entries, he reflected often on Gisham's fire. He wrote that Gisham may have believed destroying the records would also destroy the evil they contained. But evil, Herricks observed, does not live in ink and paper. It lives in the systems that produce such records, in the people who profit from them, and in the societies that tolerate them. Burning documents does not undo injustice, it only makes accountability more difficult. In that sense, Herricks believed, Gisham's final act was as controlling as the life he had led before it. Even in destruction, he was trying to decide what would be remembered and what would be forgotten. But memory cannot be burned. Testimony cannot be reduced to ash. Whether written in ledgers or carried quietly in the minds of witnesses, truth has a way of surviving. As for what truly drove Nathaniel Gisham on April 14, 1868, we may never fully know. We have his letter. We have fragments of documents that escaped the flames. We have accounts from those who saw the smoke rise over Bellwood. But the private storm inside him, the precise thoughts that moved his hands as he stacked those ledgers, the emotions that followed him into the forest, remains sealed in time. Perhaps that is the final irony. A man devoted to careful documentation, a believer in precise record-keeping, left behind a story defined by uncertainty. His own life became the kind of incomplete narrative he once tried to prevent, remembered imperfectly, argued over endlessly, interpreted differently depending on who is telling it. What we do know is this. On a single April morning in 1868, a man chose to erase 23 years of meticulously kept records, rather than allow them to be used in ways he could no longer accept. Whether his decision sprang from conscience, fear, loyalty, or calculation is a question each listener must answer for themselves. This story reminds us that the past is never truly buried. The records we preserve, or destroy, shape how we are remembered. And sometimes, the lives most carefully documented conceal the deepest unanswered questions. What's your view? Was Gisham searching for redemption or shielding powerful men from justice? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you were drawn into this chapter of American history, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, turn on notifications, and pass this story along to someone who appreciates historical mysteries. Until next time. Remember, the things we try hardest to erase are often the ones